Hello, and welcome back to the latest episode of the Business of Compliance podcast, the podcast by compliance leaders for compliance leaders. Today, we are very honored, very happy to welcome Meghan Maneval, VP of Product Strategy and Evangelism at RiskOptics. Meghan, welcome and thank you.
Yes, thank you. It's great to be here, Patrick.
Meghan, would you mind just telling the audience or listeners a little bit about yourself so they have an understanding of who's speaking with them?
Yeah, absolutely. So
Thank you.
I am a self-proclaimed GRC nerd. I have been in the world of GRC and compliance right from the get-go, right out of college. First job as an IT auditor. And then really just came up through looking at some of the new advancements in emerging technology as I was moving through sort of that security career. So when PCI first started coming out, Bank Secrecy Act, that was a big one where I was working at a credit union, kind of pivoted when ISO 27001 started to become more popular, and really worked my way through, compliance, audit, infosec into the risk management world. And then about 2 years ago, I found myself at RiskOptics. And so I actually was a customer of RiskOptics, used their product for many years, out in the wild. And at the time, they were looking at what the next enhancements were for their product. And they thought, what better than to have GRC people helping lead their product strategy team? So I built up this product strategy team of technical product managers from various elements of GRC. I have people who are super into risks and threats, and somebody who's more on like the vulnerability side, and somebody who really understands audits, and just bringing together this team of GRC experts, for lack of a better word, to really help drive that strategy so that the product is truly designed by GRC people, so that it makes sense, when you go to use it, and it works for real GRC people in the wild. So
that is so cool. So thinking about your path, so you started out as an auditor, you worked your way up now to VP of Product and Evangelism.
yep.
Daniel Kahneman, who wrote this book called Thinking Fast and Slow, where he talks about how when things are new to us, we necessarily think slowly about them. With more time and seed, more context, more understanding, we can begin thinking really, really quickly, really fast about whatever the thing is. It sounds like you've had an opportunity to really develop the time and seed to think fast about GRC, about specifically risk, and using tools to evaluate and mitigate risk. And you've built a team around that can do the same thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's absolutely what it is. And we kind of joke internally that our team has over a century of GRC experience.
Yeah.
But it is true. We kind of added it up and figured it out. But I feel like when I talk to customers, they're very rarely are they going to come to us with a challenge that stumps us, because we've been through it. We've been in the trenches. We've been there setting up GRC programs or working on multi-framework compliance. That's a big one people come to us with, or even just establishing risk management. We've been in the trenches, we know that. And so it really helps, not just from a product standpoint, but we've built a lot of education into our platform as well, so that as people are using it, it's not just a tool, it's really helping them build a solid foundation and then scale their program into the future as their needs change.
And Meghan, I think you hit on something really important here. And for our executives that are listening, there can be an element of FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt about what it is that you need to do and what steps you need to take. And so, Meghan, in your experience, what are the issues, maybe a couple of issues that organizations are bringing to you? And what are the points of learning that you found have been most impactful for those that choose to engage with you?
Yeah, I think the biggest one that we see coming from the compliance side really is that multi-framework management there. I know when I was in one of my InfoSec roles, we were aligning to ISO 27001, but we had to consider HIPAA, we had to consider PCI, we had some underlying specific regulations for our industry. And so I think that's really where we start to see people struggle, especially the last year and a half, when all the different states are coming out with their state-specific privacy regulations.
Right, privacy stuff.
Yeah, I mean, if you're already looking at, let's say, GDPR and CCPA, like those are sort of the established ones, there's probably a fair amount of overlap with some of those new states. But a lot of times compliance folks think like, oh, we're starting from scratch, or, oh, it's all these extra, this framework. And so what we do, and what I've always told folks to do, is really just to break it down and actually look at the controls, or to even break it down more simple, what are you literally doing? Like, what are you doing today?
With the
Right?
form. Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
sometimes that one thing that you're doing can be used across multiple frameworks. And so instead of starting with a framework, start with what you're doing and just document that. And we recommend the secure controls framework. They do not pay me, I don't get royalties from them, but it is fantastic because it's got a set of common sort of genericized controls. They're already open source mapped to countless frameworks. And so really just kind of when you're starting off, put the compliance aside for a moment. You have to start with the governance, that G, like it's the first letter for a reason. You have to start with controls and what you're doing today. And then you can apply those out to the different frameworks and requirements. And that's
And
probably the biggest challenge we see from our customers.
And to the executives listening, and Megan just mentioned the secure controls framework. Yes, secure controls framework,
Yep.
SCF, completely and totally open source, if memory serves. There
Yeah.
are a couple of competing frameworks. I think the Unified Compliance Framework, the UCF, has Common Controls Hub, which is a service that does a very similar mapping at a cost. And then the CSA has CCM, I believe it's called, the Common Controls Matrix. But Megan, to your point, SCF, at least in my experience, has been one of the most usable, the most useful frameworks for quickly and easily understanding how your controls do overlay between various standards.
We've had it built into the RiskOptics product since the beginning. And back then, GRC was the original multi-framework cross-mapping built on one of the original. Yeah, we actually worked and partnered directly with Tom from Compliance Forge on developing that. And it's really been the backbone of our product. And one of the things that I think it also enables it to do when you're thinking about, that moving quickly, right? And especially for executives, I remember really distinctly, someone on our board being like, hey, what's it going to take for you to get, for us to get SedRamp, or like, what's it going to take for us to get, insert, framework name. And when you have that common control set, and especially with something like the SCF, you can then go and really quickly do a gap analysis and say, well, I already have these maybe 50 controls in place. That equates to about, 80% coverage. It's not perfect, but at least you can give a quick, this is where we're at. We've got some coverage here. Here's the gaps. This is how we can approach it. And it really, really helps, almost like I don't want to call it instant, but essentially an instant gap analysis of where are some of those things that you would need to focus on.
And Megan, do you find that as you do look across various standards, you mentioned ISO, you mentioned SOC, you mentioned HIPAA, do you find that in that gap analysis that there's more commonality between those standards than people necessarily think?
Oh, absolutely. When we have customers who first start onboarding into like the RiskOptics product, we always say start with the most complicated framework that you have. So a lot of people will start with ISO because it is very detailed. Excuse me, ISO 27. So they'll start with a SOC 2 as well, depending on what they have there. But when you do that and you establish those controls first and you had it mapped to that first framework, then again, when you add the next one, it's every time you add a new one, the gaps get smaller and smaller because there is quite a bit of overlap there.
Yeah.
So let's say you start with ISO 27001 and then you add PCI. Well, maybe that's about 50% coverage. But then you bring in SOC 2. You're going to start to see varying levels of coverage. And then as you fill some of those gaps, again, it's going to cross-fill across frameworks. And that's why really bringing it down to the control level and even some of the underlying like processes that roll into those controls, it's really, really valuable because anytime, again, like you bring on a new framework, even if you're not jumping into it right away, maybe you just want to monitor it. Like, hey, maybe in the future we want to do XYZ. Now you can start to exactly.
Yes. Now, Megan, one of the things that I've heard you talk about in the past is that in your perspective, security and compliance are two fundamentally different things and should be approached as such. Maybe help me understand that a little bit better. And then with that, how do you actually have that conversation with the board in such a way so that they can understand and actually do something meaningful?
Yeah. Well, I will actually start with a story because I love making fun of myself to teach lessons to people. So I started off in an InfoSec role. It was my first like official like running the program, and we went in, and I don't know how soon it was, but we had an audit come in. We had a customer audit, and I'm new. I kind of know the basics of it, and they ask, "Hey, do you vulnerability scanners?" And I'm like, "Yes, we have Tenable. Of course, we have vulnerability scans. Let me log in. Let me show you our security center. Look how beautiful it is. We've got like no critical vulnerabilities. Everything's been patched. Beautiful. Everything correct, right? Compliance. We passed an audit. I find out like a couple weeks later or something, or after the audit, that it's actually not configured to scan anything in our production network. It was only scanning a test VLAN that we had set up initially. It might have gone, so it was done before I got there, but they had set it up,
So
and
to
then
be
no one
clear,
ever, yeah, exactly. And then no one ever reconfigured it. So from a compliance standpoint, yeah, we had a vulnerability scanner. It was running regular scans. We were monitoring it and everything like that, but it wasn't doing anything to
were you
protect
immediately
us, right?
protected during this time?
Okay, so
Right.
security equals 0 on that one, right? But compliance equals effective. And I think that, I'm sure there's countless other, examples of that, but really what it comes down to is if you're just looking at the framework, right? And this is why I said you have to start with the governance, because the governance side is the security. It's the, what are you doing today? Hey, we have a vulnerability scanner. Oh, and here's the scope of it. And this is how often it runs, stuff like that. It's the what. And you have to start with the what. Now, the compliance is a great way of identifying those gaps, but if you're just looking for gaps and checking that box and not actually digging into what you're doing for that, then that's really where it starts to break down. So from like a board standpoint, if you're thinking about it from like a leadership standpoint, it can be really easy to get a little bit blinded by compliance reports of, hey, we passed an audit. This is great. But at the same time, really you have to strike that balance of, okay, we passed an audit, but is it really reducing the risk? Is it really providing security? And that's another layer.
Megan, you just hit on something really near and dear to my heart, and that is kind of this definition of governance. I think there's a lot of different ways to look at this, a lot of different ways to slice that pie. But ISACA, through COVID, oddly enough, defined governance as a value creation process wherein an organization, how is it they worded it? Governance equals creating desired outcomes at an optimized risk and cost, not minimal, but an
Right.
optimized risk and cost. So three
Yeah.
basic variables there. What do we really want? What are our desired outcomes? What cost can we handle? And what risk is optimized for us, for our appetite and our environment, which is where I think organizations like yours and people like you become so critically important in helping executives and boards understand that there is a risk that has to be estimated as part of the overall value creation process. And there are easy ways, let me tell you, that there are direct ways to
Yeah.
control that risk in many ways. Maybe not easy, but direct
Yeah.
ways.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, no, and that's really what it is. And I think when I was, again, I'm going to make fun of myself for a minute. I was in another role. I was overseeing governance and risk management. And then my peer manager was overseeing compliance. And we reported into the same director, and we would go into a meeting and he would report, hey, we had 2 control failures as part of this and, blah, 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 whatever. And my boss would look at me and go, okay, what does that do for our risk posture? And one, I don't know. Two, well, first one, I didn't know the controls failed. So, let's take a step back
That's a
there.
big eye opener if I'm being honest.
That's the big one. Exactly. And so I think really what the last 2 years of what we've been working on and really what we came out with about a year ago or so is this connection of controls and risk. Because that's really what it is. If you think about how we're measuring risk, the way we reduce risk is by implementing controls. And so if you can connect those two and you can see fully effective, highly mature control in place to prevent, or I guess not prevent, but reduce the impact of this risk or reduce the likelihood of this risk. Well, if that control fails, you want to see that risk go up. Or vice versa. That control is effective, that risk can go down. And that's really where I think we can come together from the C side and the G and the R and together and say, all right, how do these things influence each other? They're not just objects out in the world, they influence each other. And when you can make those connections, it becomes that cost value, right? You can go to your board and say, we have a risk of, business interruption, downtime that could cost X, Y, or Z. If we implemented this control or matured this control, it'll cost this, but, and you can start to weigh that risk. And that's really to communicate with your leadership. You have to tie that control or that investment to a risk and a risk reduction there to make sure the cost is the benefits there.
So maybe to say this a little different way, and correct me if I misstate, but for the executives listening, that control listing you're describing is just a listing of ways that we've chosen to mitigate risk in the environment. It's
Exactly.
as straightforward as that.
Yeah, that's really what a control is. It's something that you put in place to both reduce risk and meet compliance requirements. And I think sometimes people focus on the fact that a control is in place to meet compliance requirements. And it's like, no, the purpose of compliance isn't to be compliant, right? The purpose of putting controls in place is to reduce risk. And the way you ensure it's reducing risk is through compliance. And that's really where we have to see that handshake really solidly in there, where, people, especially in today's world with emerging threats and new technologies and everybody's around the globe, you have to be playing in the same sandbox to see how your actions are influencing the other
And as you're
areas.
describing this, Megan, it feels like it needs to be a living, breathing, operationalized
Yeah,
process. And
absolutely.
in my experience, in the organizations that I've worked with in the past, this is not everyone, but it's not uncommon to see organizations treat risk assessment and risk treatment as annualized events. I'll do my
Yep.
annual risk assessment or upon
Yeah.
significant change in the environment. I think by and large that's become common as well. But it
Yeah.
almost feels like that's the wrong way to go about things. And this absolutely has to be a standardized process, an operational
Yeah.
process.
I wouldn't say it's necessarily wrong. You definitely still want to check in once a year or so and check in with your owners and evaluate, hey, are we really doing, are we on track with our plans and stuff like that? But I think it goes beyond that. And we have this concept at RiskOptics that we kind of coined called always on risk management.
Oh,
And if you think about it, the way it works is, let's say risk is up here in the middle. You've got threats that are feeding into that may or may not change often, right? But you've also got vulnerabilities that can impact that threat, or vice versa. The threat can impact vulnerability. So as new vulnerabilities are being identified within your system, as threats change, stuff like that, all of that influences your inherent risk. And so in theory, you never have to change your inherent risk if you've got that automation. You're just closing and opening vulnerabilities,
right.
adjusting threats, things like that. So let's say you get this huge major vulnerability, your risk of, let's say, unauthorized access, that's going to skyrocket. But then you fix that. Well, now your risk goes back down, but you never had to touch it. You're just doing your operational day-to-day work. And the flip side of that too with controls, let's say you go and assess a control and it fails, your residual risk should go up based on that. And that's really what we've developed here is this algorithm where, and again, it's based on the SCF, like it's public information out there. It's academically sound, but nobody ever built that into like a platform, right? And so now with RiskOptics, I'm sorry, I'm getting a little salesy. I don't mean
Yeah.
to, but like the
Yeah.
way it works really is you have a risk register that is fed by your threats and your vulnerabilities on one side and your controls and exceptions on the other. And you have an always on risk. You can go and look at like a little stock ticker up and down just as you're doing your activities over time. And you can set those thresholds. So you can go to your board and say, hey, we did these things. This is what happened. We're now over a threshold. We need to do some more things and bring it back down. And it really just makes it more dynamic. So you're not waiting for that year to go back and go, oh shoot, we didn't do these things. You're getting it as you're just conducting your basic security and compliance activities.
And suddenly you're not having a conversation really led by your opinion, by your gut. It sounds
Mm-hmm.
like you'll have really empirical data to take to the board to
Exactly.
help you make proper
Yeah.
decisions.
Exactly. I mean, you can literally say this risk of unauthorized access is considered critical because we have these 3 open vulnerabilities that could impact these threats, and we have these control failures. And that's a much more, better conversation than being like, I think we have some high risk. It's data driven, it's tangible, and you can really visualize those changes over time and make those risk versus reward conversations and decisions.
And Megan, if you could swag it, and I don't know if you're close enough to your customers' processes to know, but if you could swag, I mean, what are a handful of the top risks that organizations are treating today through various
Yeah.
controls?
Yeah, so we have a built-in risk register that comes out of the box with RiskOptics, and it's based on the NIST risk register, some SDS stuff, and just some stuff that we've put in there in general. And it's about, I want to say 60 or so risks. And different organizations kind of whittle that down a little bit. But there are things like business interruption, unauthorized access, lost or stolen assets are a big
Okay.
one these days. Reputational risk is a big one as well, especially now with AI and deep fake, right? Like that's going to become a really big,
Huge.
issue with that. Those are ones that we really see tend to be the biggest ones, but those are also a lot of the risks where you have a ton of control options. So even just thinking about like unauthorized access, you have technical access controls you can put in place. You've got administrative policies and training you can do. You've got backup, so like you can really start to create and visualize like, yeah, we've got this risk of unauthorized access, but look at all the cool stuff that we're already doing to support it. And because again, we use the SCF, it's almost, you get this risk baseline kind of on day one. And then, like I was just saying, you add in your vulnerabilities, you add in your controls, just doing that operationally, you get this amazing always on score. And I think that that's really what we need to move towards. And then you add an automated evidence collection and mind blown, like you just put it on autopilot, right? But, it's one of those things where we have to start thinking about how things influence and impact each other. And I think the moving globally in the workforce is really emphasize that you're not sitting next to somebody in the office anymore
And we
who's,
never will
talking
again.
about that stuff. And we never will.
We
Exactly.
never will again. Yeah.
Yeah.
And Megan, you open the door for me to to ask a question. That
Go
is that
ahead.
we're going to can of words. AI. I mean, how do you
Yes.
see? Oh, we'll just keep it limited to LLMs. Something really basic that I think has become pretty pervasive at this point. How do you see AI, specifically LLMs, changing the risk landscape and the posture that organizations need to present to both their employees and the outside world?
Yeah. So I think, and this may be I don't know, unpopular, weird opinion, right? But like, I think we have the processes in place to deal with AI. I think people are just kind of thinking it's this bright, shiny thing, and you're either afraid of it because you don't know what to do, or you're jumping in without testing controls, which either way is bad, right?
Yes.
But I think from my stance, it's again, you're just looking at the risk associated with it. And so if we're looking at a large language model, for example, look at it the same way you would assess any other, maybe an internal system for a business impact assessment, or even like a third party due diligence, right? Look at that tool, that AI model. What kind of data is in scope? What does it do for you? What does it access? Is it making decisions? Things like that. And really bringing it down to risk. And then it's a matter of, what are you trying to do with that particular large language model, and what could prevent you from getting there? I mean, it's just sort of, in my opinion, it's a basic asset-based risk assessment. It's, what are you trying to do? What could stop you from getting there? And what is this asset, for lack of a better word, touch and do for your company? And we have those tools in our toolbox. It's just a matter of, maybe tweaking them, and even thinking about, controls and things like that. I've been digging into the ISO, and if you have ISO 27, already have the mechanisms. It's going to ask you to do management review. Okay, cool. So just add AI to your management review agenda, and you're good, And I think that's really where people need to start, is look at what you already have. And it's just like any other framework or any other new requirement set that you might have.
To your point, and again, for the execs listening, if you already have an ISMS, an information security management system, an ISO 27001 certification, ISO 42001 certification is going to follow a very similar pattern, wherein the standard has clauses and annex controls. And to Megan's point, from a clause perspective, there is considerable overlap between the standards. So if you have good governance and management processes in place today, very likely you're already thinking the right way. It's just a matter of some minor updates and tweaks. And then, Megan, as you were talking about implementing or deploying AI in an environment, you used words like, what are you really trying to do? Know what you want, understand what that is. It's like an asset. And it almost brings me back to the definition of value creation from earlier, creating desired outcomes that optimize risk and cost. What do we really want to create here? And what cost are we willing to pay? And what's the risk that we're willing to assume to do this? So it does feel like it's very approachable for people if they take time to think about what it is that they really want to do and how they can protect it.
Yeah. I mean, and if you think about, if you're already doing risk assessments as part of project management, or even part of like change management, change control processes, software development lifecycle, it's really just replicating some of those controls. Now, obviously, some are going to need adjustments, because particularly with AI, there's nuances to it that obviously you're going to need to adjust. It's not going to be perfect. But it really does remind me, when I went, the organization I was working at, we had ISO 9001, so the quality management system, and we were aligning with 27001. And it was a very similar thing. It's like, all right, well, we already have quality management system. We just need to add in some information security policies. We're already doing, internal audits. Now we just have to add this. And so again, the ISO standards make it super, super smooth to kind of have that scalability. But even if you don't, looking at like your project management and really seeing like, hey, we're already evaluating X, Y, and Z as part of, project management or vendor due diligence, whatever it might be. Adding in, we did that in our product as well. We added in as part of our third-party risk management process, does this vendor use AI? And just asking that, like adding that into your thing. Now you
Yes.
can filter and see and check in and monitor, that type of stuff of what vendors are using AI on your behalf. How are they using it? All that type of stuff.
So that you can understand third, in some cases, fourth party risk, which is
Yeah.
becoming more and more important. Yes,
Mm-hmm.
yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
And maybe
absolutely.
in your estimation, what is for executives, for the business leaders that you currently work with, what's the biggest misunderstanding that they bring to the table as they engage with risk optics?
I think a lot of it is, I think they think, and I'll kind of take a step back. A lot of times we're dealing with like C-suite, company leadership, even, board members,
Yes.
things like that. They tend to think of GRC and compliance as a technical, like an IT thing. And I think a lot of
Yeah.
times it kind of gets pushed off into the IT department, which, I mean, for better or worse, like that's, yes, a lot of it is in there. But I think where we spend a lot of time and really, I think we had an ebook about it as well, is how to communicate it so your board will understand it. And it's bringing it out of IT and making it relevant to the business. And so even we were just talking about like with AI, what is it doing, right? At the end of the day, when you're looking at GRC, you have to look at where your company is trying to go and how you can help them get there and align with their business objectives. And when you start to have those conversations where you can say, I know you really want to expand in EMEA or you really want to expand in the APAC area. Well, hey, here's some considerations. Here's some controls we might need to put in place. Here's some new regulations we might need to look at. And you get to be a little bit more proactive when you communicate it in the context of your business. And I think getting people to speak the same language is one of the biggest challenges that we see. And we're really starting to get, it's that education, right? It's that when you have those conversations and you can break it down in a way that people will understand, it doesn't become fuck, right? It just becomes something real. It becomes data driven, advice. You can be an enabler there with the rest of the business.
Megan, that I find that I tend to be overly optimistic. I don't know if those that you work with tend to wear race-colored glasses or not. Is
Yeah.
that something that's common at all?
Yeah. Oh
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, it's funny. You kind of get the couple of groups. So you get, the rose colored glasses, like you mentioned, of like, oh, we passed an audit. Everything, this is great. Everything's fine. Then you kind of get the blinders, which is kind of worse of, oh, we passed an audit. We don't need to do anything else. I'm going to turn over here. It's
Before
fine.
next year. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We'll wait. Here are the things that I can directly control that can help us or hurt us. Here's some red flags, things like that. And it really just makes the conversation a lot more productive.
And you mentioned addressing the human element. I heard it said somewhere that for people to really want to change, to do something different, you have to be able to help them answer two questions: a question of ability and a question of motivation. Can I do it? Will it be worth it? Can I do it? Will it be worth it? I mean, it seems like the will it be worth it is really going to be different for whatever executive you're dealing with, whether they're talking about hitting their okay financial directive. As I think about areas in which people need real help, real guidance, and being able to answer the question, can I do it? It feels like you've developed a tool set and really a way of thinking about risk that allows people to do just that makes risk something that's approachable and something that's active.
Exactly. And, I will give a shout out to our CRO, Tim Maloney, my boss, who is has a famous phrase of, you have to make a withdrawal or a deposit in the bank of trust. And so any person that you're talking to, right, if you need something from them, you are making a withdrawal from that bank of trust. Like, Patrick, I need you to go do this thing for me to do for whatever reason, right?
Yeah.
And so there always has to be a deposit in that bank of trust. So I don't want, if you're always going to your board, it's like, we need this, we need this, we need this, then they're constantly going to be like, oh, what do you want? But if you're going to your board or your leadership or whoever from that sense of collaboration, from that sense of we're in this together, or even to the point of, hey, I did this research, I think this can really help you, or things like that, where you're coming at it from a different angle, Now it's a different conversation to go and say, hey, you know, this project we've been working on together, I did a little bit more research and I think we might have to invest over here. You know, it's a very different conversation than just going in and being like, we need to invest over here. And so having that human relationship is so key. And as we move into, you know, this global world, as we're talking about, having the tools and the centralized database to go in and say like, hey, take a look at this, or let me share this with you. This is where it's coming from. You know, of course, access control and permissions aside, but, you know, having those conversations where you can collaborate, and it makes it easier when you have to ask that person for something
It
or
sounds
an
like what
investment.
you're talking about is really building a partnership between peers, between individual groups inside the organization, between
Yeah.
executives at the board and executives. True partnership, but mature partnership in a lot of
Yeah.
ways. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Megan, as you think about the future of where GRC is going, not just
Mhm.
where we've been, but where we're going, if even over the next 3 to 5 years, which may be too long, but any significant changes you see coming, any kind of gotchas you think are going to be waiting for people as they do mature through the process?
Yeah, I think kind of going back to what we were talking about at the beginning of like the multi frameworks, I think the biggest thing that's going to be a challenge is every institution, every country, every whatever coming out with new regulations. It seems like, or just changing regulations. I mean, even if you look at like NIST CSF by an update this year, you know,
Yes.
there's been a ton of new framework, you know, PCI, you know, and I feel like, you know, as we're not, it's not going to stop, right? Whether it's new
Yeah.
updates, whether it's completely new, net new frameworks. And I think people, the biggest issue people are going to run into is they're going to feel like, again, we have to start from scratch. Like, oh my gosh, there's so many frameworks just coming at me fast and furious that they're going to feel like they can't keep up. They're going to miss things. And I think taking the time now to set up a solid governance structure. Remember, I kind of joke, you know, it starts with the G. It starts with governance. It starts with controls and
Yes.
policies and processes and the technology that you have. And if you can get a solid governance structure, now when a new, you know, framework comes out or a framework changes, again, you're not starting from scratch. It's not like a 2-year process to get us compliant and doing all, you know, this stuff like that. It becomes much more scalable. But you can't do that if you're going framework by framework. And so if you're just focusing on, all right, I got my SOC 2, and then over here's my ISO, and then over here's this, every new framework is going to be a new framework. And so
Correct.
establishing, yeah, that foundation now is then going to let you to reuse and build and scale on top of that. But you need the foundation.
You need the foundation, and you need, this may be a little self-serving, but you also need an audit firm to partner with that understand the foundation you're building
Oh
and is
yeah.
not only comfortable, but on board with aligning compliance to you, because
Yeah.
compliance very much is a personalized thing for the personality of each organization.
Oh,
And
absolutely. And getting that control baseline in place and then having, you know, an external audit firm come in and take a look at it. I mean, such a valuable add. And that way, you know, you're building it on a solid foundation. You've got
yeah,
experts who've taken a look at it. And now it becomes much more manageable to maintain because you've got that baseline out the box, or
and
at
so
least
it's
at the gate.
incremental as opposed to starting all over again. You know, it's
Exactly.
funny, as you talk about kind of managing your ISO in isolation from your SOC assessment and isolation from your HIPAA or PCI assessment. I think about the task switching and just the
Mm-hmm.
sheer amount of time lost from the inefficiency of driving processes that way. Are
Mm-hmm.
people still doing that? Is that still a
I
common thing?
mean, yes. Well, a lot of times, I think the people I talk to a lot when they're new customers coming into RiskOptics is they're coming to us because they are at that point. They're like, hey, we've managed our SOC 2, or we've managed this, or we've managed that, and we're out of spreadsheets, and we need to combine. And I think that's a really normal place to be. A lot of times, customers come to us and they're like, oh, I'm so embarrassed. I'm like, don't. This is great. You know, we got you, right? I've seen this a million times.
Yeah.
But I think that's really where you know, I think people are gonna trip up a little bit with that, you know, having that isolation there.
Yes, ma'am. Megan, what have we not talked about that you think is important for executives to know?
You know, I think one thing I'm gonna call it out, and is a passion of mine. You know, diversity, equity, and inclusion is a big thing as we move in. You know, has been for many years, but especially as we're moving into, you know, a global environment, globally you know, dispersed environment, making sure that organizations can support a diverse workforce.
Yes.
I'm gonna actually be a little selfish and kind of shout out. I'm actually in the process of studying for a doctoral degree where I'm actually looking at the nexus of neurodiversity and artificial intelligence in corporate corporations. And so looking to see how AI can either hurt or potentially hinder the inclusion of neurodiverse employees in the workforce. And that is something that I think if boards are not considering, a lot of times neurodiversity wasn't considered as part of diversity. It was really focused on, gender and ethnicity and things like
Sure.
that. But
Yeah.
knowing that that element of diversity is huge, and a lot of times technologies and emerging technologies can be negative towards, for folks with neurodiversity. A really great example, I have an auditory processing disorder. I rely on reading lips a lot of times. And when COVID happened, people were wearing masks. And so in-person events, I was screwed. I could not, especially if you were in a major event center where I couldn't hear, it was very difficult for me. And so, and that's an in-person example, but there are things, like closed captions on Zoom that are extremely helpful for me, because if somebody's little face is, in a Zoom box, and that's helpful for me, where there are, I'm sure, tools like that that are extremely helpful for other neurodiverse individuals. And so really looking at how we as organizations can leverage some, emerging technologies, and really just being aware of how those things impact the workforce.
Megan, that is absolutely amazing. Absolutely amazing. With an
Yeah.
accent like mine, closed caption attributed a number of things to me that I've never actually said.
That
So
is true. That is true.
yeah.
I have a couple weird words I pronounce weird as well, and so closed captions kind of mess up a little bit, but better than nothing, I would say.
Well, for our listeners, are there things that they can do to aid and support the research that you're doing? Is there anything now that we can do to be a benefit for you?
Oh my gosh, that's so awesome. Actually, I'm really in the early phases of getting my project approved by the doctoral board. And then I'm really doing, I'm looking at case studies right now of situations where, there's been accommodations put in place to support neurodiversity, or other examples of where artificial intelligence has been used to support the workforce. One of the things I found is that there's been a lot of studies related to artificial intelligence as part of like onboarding processes, HR processes, credit checks, or things like that, where they have been used for traditional business processes, but there isn't a lot of research on how they've been used to directly support employees and employee inclusion and things like that. And so really just at this point gathering resources. So yeah, if anybody has examples or even just candid stories, things like that, I would love to hear them. Anything is going to be helpful within my project for sure.
And I imagine at some point, some sort of survey or data collection
Yes.
instrument is going to be necessary.
Exactly. Exactly.
Our
Yes.
listeners to be prepared to participate.
Exactly. Yeah.
Megan, thank you so much for making space today. Again, very, very honored to have you. For our listeners, we'll include Megan's contact information in our show notes, so it'll be available. Should you need anything, and Megan, I assume it's okay to reach out to you directly.
Absolutely. Yeah. Reach out on LinkedIn. I'm happy to connect with anybody and happy to continue the conversation. Absolutely.
Meghan Maneval, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me, Patrick. Really appreciate it.
The pleasure's mine. Bye.
Bye.